as the weather, the rain and snow started to break, there was a rainbow across the sky that stopped. And it stopped right over the area where they eventually found her the next day. And where it stopped, there was a bald eagle that was flying in that area. And the search and rescue team said, that's a sign, we're going to find her tomorrow.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. I think when people are grieving, it is important to try to find meaning in suffering. And so when people are seeing signs, and Gabby Petito's family have spoken quite a lot about that, seeing rainbows, seeing shapes in the clouds and so on, that is how they are finding some meaning, some purpose, some message in something that has happened that is heartbreaking and tragic and otherwise meaningless. And while it is okay for family and friends to do that sort of thing, to find meaning in this suffering, in the middle of the suffering, law enforcement investigators must look towards the science, must look towards the evidence. And so in this episode, I'm going to draw your attention to something that hasn't been spoken about as far as I know, something that hasn't been discussed as far as I know, that is quite important. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. For all the emphasis lately on bruises on Gabby's back, I don't know why there's so little interest in this. Gabby's actually showing, role-playing and describing some of the injuries that she does have. And what does Brian do according to Gabby? Well, he grabs, right? And we've heard in the autopsy finding that it is the cause of death is strangulation. And doesn't that sound like a grabbing action? Grabbing a certain part of the body, right? In Gabby's description, which she actually role plays, she actually shows with her own hands what Brian was doing. She shows Brian holding and suppressing more than lashing out. But the incident at the Mary Piglets indicates he is able to lash out, certainly in a verbal sense and in public when triggered. Now, what is very unfortunate with the body cam footage as we've seen it from both officers, it's difficult and frustrating to see a scratch on Gabby's face. And ironically, by far the most footage we see of Gabby, we see from the uninjured, unscratched side of her cheek. This is because we're seeing her always on the opposite side of the vehicle in terms of seating, to the side Brian was sitting on, to the side Gabby faced Brian when she received these injuries. The bruise to her arm is also on the side facing away from the officer. I did find this, which reveals a small, fresh scar just to the right, and that's from the viewer's perspective, of her mouth. Now, I highlighted this on a different platform before the autopsy result came out, but as I mentioned before, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And so this was an incident of past behavior which essentially predicted what was going to happen. And as I mentioned before, Brian's interest in ultra-violent literature and games, as well as the violence towards his fiancée that preceded the incident by just 2 weeks, may have manifested once again at the Spread Creek camp. Did it happen early in the evening? Was there difficulty sleeping? Were there bugs biting? Were there other things that were annoying both of them? Was there something going on social media? What was going on? What was the conversation that they had? Now I want to deal with a separate issue, which is the hyoid bone, which is likely what gave the medical examiner a clear indication of what actually happened to Gabby. Now, you've got to, I'm not going to be too graphic about this, but you've got to kind of see the decomposition as basically something that is distorting your view. You can't see blemishes, you can't see marks, you can't see things like bruises, right? And so the way that you see through all of that is by using an X-ray, and you are X-raying a particular part of the anatomy, in this case the sort of neck throat area, and there's a telltale U-shaped bone. It's the only bone in the human body that floats in the tissues. It actually starts off as a flexible cartilage and it hardens with age, so that by the time someone is an adult, so around about Gabby's age, it starts to become a lot harder and less flexible. So it's important to bear in mind that the U-shaped hyoid bone actually starts off as cartilage in children and young adults and is flexible. And it doesn't have to be broken, as an expert has asserted, just bruised or slightly damaged for something like manual strangulation to be a likely cause, right? What happens with when the hands are on the neck area is that it tends to trap the hyoid bone. You have these big grasping implements and this bone can't get out of the way. And so that is how the bone gets trapped and then damaged, right? When there's something like ligature, when a ligature is used, it tends to slip over the bone and under the jawbone, and that typically won't damage the hyoid bone. And so a damaged hyoid bone is idiosyncratic to the cause of death that has been established here. We see exactly the same thing in the Rebecca Zahau case, also a South African case involving a woman called Susan Roder, and then more recently Shanann Watts. I will put a link in the description dealing with a Wikipedia article so you can see exactly which bone we're talking about. In Gabby's case, she was still relatively young, so the structure may still have been relatively flexible and thus may well not have broken, just have been bruised or damaged some way. We'll know for sure at trial. Something else I want to bring up, and it may not be particularly pleasant to say, but although you might think of that bald eagle circling over the area where Gabby was actually ultimately found, you might think of that as a good omen or something like that. But, if you go into the science of it, a bald eagle is also a scavenger. And so it's possible that is why the bald eagle was in the area. In the next episode, I'm going to be talking in a little bit more detail about Brian Laundrie's art, specifically the logo that he has to identify himself, which is this blade inside of a melting ice cream. So we're going to be talking about that in the next episode. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.